today, I'm excited to announce the establishment of the first ever Puerto Rico Federal Statistical Research Data Center, which will provide researchers with secure local access to federal and local data for advanced statistical research and analysis. At its very core, this center creates partnerships that ensures that data security, fidelity, and confidentiality are number one. This center joins a network of 33 other centers across the United States. Only 33 other centers across the United States. Puerto Rico is getting one of them.
I want to thank the U.S. Census for taking this initiative to open the 34th Federal Statistic Research Center. Deputy Secretary Graves and I have had many discussions on data, so it's nice to see those discussions actually turn to action. This center will provide a large set of data more readily available to economists, students, analysts, and us, the Oversight Board. When I think about Puerto Rico's future, I think about what can be, but this requires data. We all have dreams, we all have visions of what we want the future to look like. But how can we make those visions come true if we cannot determine where we stand right now? How can we determine our path to the future without a map? To envision and plan means to study the facts and to quantify information.
The data we have, especially when we talk about economic development, is the data the world sees, right? If investors around the world don't see what we have, then they'll underestimate the market of Puerto Rico. They'll underestimate the potential of Puerto Rico.
I want to congratulate and welcome the University of Puerto Rico to this family, and I'm going to call it a family, of researchers across the whole country who are dedicated to doing research with confidential versions of statistical agency data. These data are extremely rich, extremely powerful, and in the hands of good, dedicated researchers can do the kinds of things that improve people's lives.
We too, here at the Oversight Board, depend on data for our fiscal plans, for our budgets, and for the reforms to help Puerto Rico define and conquer its future path towards fiscal stability, economic growth, and prosperity. We can all have different opinions, but we should all have the same facts. Data is the basis for good policy decision making. It is critical to create policies that meet the real needs of the people of Puerto Rico. Policies that are relevant, policy that actually solves problems, and policies that are based on facts.
Before we continue, how has your trip been around the world?
So far, amazing.
Glad to know it.
See what you're doing, yeah.
So now, my partner here is going to lead you to. Pues ahora iríamos a la otra sesión para presentar los otros campos. Thanks, sweetie.
Kita parating mo na dyan, well, salitin ko and then may stand.
Well, I'm really excited. I learned a lot when I had the opportunity to meet with some really, really cool people here on the island during this visit. I had the opportunity to meet with the leaders of the Puerto Rico Science Trust. These are people who are leaders in their field, who are experts, who are extremely passionate in what they're doing. And the island's in good hands. And I know that everybody working together is going to really help the economic development of this island. And again, a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's exactly what we need. You know, as a board, we've worked very hard to get the financial troubles in check and to get the boat floating again. And now we all need to work together. And as I met, the leader of the Puerto Rico Science Trust, and we met with the president of the UPR, and understood how everybody's working together and trying to come together to really build the future of the island, I was really excited. I left with a really bright hope of the future of Puerto Rico. And so I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to do that.
Today, I'm excited to announce the establishment of the first ever Puerto Rico Federal Statistical Research Data Center, which will provide researchers with secure local access to federal and local data for advanced statistical research and analysis. At its very core, this center creates partnerships that ensures that data security, fidelity, and confidentiality are number one. This center joins a network of 33 other centers across the United States. Only 33 other centers across the United States. Puerto Rico is getting one of them.
I want to thank the U.S. Census for taking this initiative to open the 34th Federal Statistic Research Center. Deputy Secretary Graves and I have had many discussions on data, so it's nice to see those discussions actually turn to action. This center will provide a large set of data more readily available to economists, students, analysts, and us, the Oversight Board. When I think about Puerto Rico's future, I think about what can be, but this requires data. We all have dreams, we all have visions of what we want the future to look like. But how can we make those visions come true if we cannot determine where we stand right now? How can we determine our path to the future without a map? To envision and plan means to study the facts and to quantify information.
The data we have, especially when we talk about economic development, is the data the world sees, right? If investors around the world don't see what we have, then they'll underestimate the market of Puerto Rico. They'll underestimate the potential of Puerto Rico.
I want to congratulate and welcome the University of Puerto Rico to this family, and I'm going to call it a family, of researchers across the whole country who are dedicated to doing research with confidential versions of statistical agency data. These data are extremely rich, extremely powerful, and in the hands of good, dedicated researchers can do the kinds of things that improve people's lives.
We too, here at the Oversight Board, depend on data for our fiscal plans, for our budgets, and for the reforms to help Puerto Rico define and conquer its future path towards fiscal stability, economic growth, and prosperity. We can all have different opinions, but we should all have the same facts. Data is the basis for good policy decision making. It is critical to create policies that meet the real needs of the people of Puerto Rico. policies that are relevant, policy that actually solves problems, and policies that are based on facts.
Comencé a trabajar con el registro por una convocatoria de internado y actualmente soy como estudiante interna del registro de la propiedad, un programa del Departamento de Justicia y la UPR.
Para mí la experiencia del trabajo en el registro ha sido excelente. A mí me encanta. Por lo menos entre estudiantes de derechos reales, que el registro de la propiedad cae bajo esa materia de derecho, tiende a ser de las más técnicas, algunos dicen las más aburridas, pero personalmente a mí me encanta. Las controversias que uno ve día a día. Y un factor para mí muy importante es que esto afecta a muchas personas directamente.
En el plan fiscal se establece como prioridad mantener el registro de la propiedad al día, en tanto que este es un instrumento vital para el tráfico comercial de bienes inmuebles. Cuando estábamos explorando alternativas para trabajar con el registro de la propiedad y lograr poner el mismo al día, surgió la idea de contar con estudiantes de la Universidad de Puerto Rico, que son muchachos muy talentosos, un banco de talento ahí que está latente, y a la misma vez pues les serviría de experiencia a ellos en el mundo laboral.
Usualmente reviso los documentos que se someten, reviso que esté todos los que se solicitan por ley, que estén conforme a lo que requiere la ley, los preparo las minutas, los despacho al registrador. En ocasiones llamo a abogados y notarios para solicitar documentos, así que ese es más o menos mi trabajo. Pienso que es un empleo que es muy bueno para tener en el CV y en el resumen en principio, y pienso que me ha dado buenas experiencias tanto de lo que es el servicio público, aunque no directamente con la ciudadanía y el público, pero es un servicio para ellos, y pues me ha dado conocimiento y destrezas en derecho que, aunque en la escuela de derecho las enseñan, aquí tengo la práctica sobre ellas.
Porque todos mis compañeros son de derecho, digo, mira, si necesitan un trabajo, solicitan registro, pagan bien, las horas son buenas y tienen una experiencia que no se compara, porque si eres un estudiante de derecho, es mejor el trabajo que tú puedes tener estando en la escuela de derecho, algo que tenga que ver con derecho.
Este proyecto ha sido muy beneficioso y ha tenido unos resultados muy positivos para todas las partes en el registro de la propiedad, en la medida en que se ha logrado reducir la cantidad de documentos en un 57% en año y medio, como mencioné anteriormente. Para nosotros en la Junta estamos muy satisfechos con el trabajo que han hecho los estudiantes y el apoyo que se le ha dado al registro. Y los estudiantes pues ciertamente han sido muy exitosos en sus labores y han tenido una oportunidad de tener práctica y experiencia en el mundo laboral real.
In our industry, it's the best time of the year. It's when we finally start to have plants blooming. So yeah, after we pick the fruit, we need to pull every a different type of farming organization, because my father was not an agronomist or a farmer.
la parte más importante de una entidad, de una organización, es su empleado. El capital humano es realmente la columna vertebral de cualquier organización. Y no es, eso aplica también a las agencias de gobierno. Así que si nosotros queremos mejorar el servicio que dan las agencias, que da el Departamento de Educación a las escuelas, a los estudiantes, tenemos que asegurar que tenemos el mejor capital humano en la agencia y que podamos no solamente reclutarlo, pero retenerlo y motivarlo para que ese sea el capital humano el que guíe los procesos de transformación dentro de la agencia. El departamento reconoce que hay unas áreas de oportunidad, creo que todos sabemos, y el departamento y la secretaria del departamento reconoce que hay unas áreas que necesitan mejorar, que necesitan cambiar. Y a veces el departamento no tiene todos los recursos para ellos transformarse ellos mismos. Así que han reconocido que trabajando esto en colaboración con el equipo de la Junta, pues pueden lograrse y avanzar estos procesos, ¿verdad? Para que ocurran más rápido y contar con el beneficio de la asesoría técnica de la Junta para que estos procesos puedan dar. Al final del día, cuando nosotros pensamos en por qué las cosas no llegan a las escuelas, por qué los materiales no llegan o por qué los maestros se tardan en reclutarse o en procesar esos procesos de recursos humanos, pues nosotros entendemos que el poder mejorar la experiencia del servicio público para poder retener y poder reclutar el mejor talento, eso va a incidir en que las áreas operativas, que son las que se encargan en darle esos servicios a las escuelas, los servicios a las escuelas puedan mejorar, y a los servicios a las escuelas mejorar, pues mejora, ¿verdad?, lo que está recibiendo el estudiante.
Por su esfuerzo en reconocer y hacer justicia a los bomberos de Puerto Rico. José Néstor Tirado García, presidente, dado hoy 17 de enero de 2024 en San Juan, Puerto Rico. Y reconocer y hacer justicia a los bomberos, eso es lo mismo que le estaba diciendo.
Gracias a ustedes. Gracias a ustedes por el trabajo que ustedes hacen.
Segundo programa es Short Form Credentials.
Okay.
La diferencia, tienen algo parecido, pero la diferencia es que los Short Form Credentials no tienen que ser universidades. Pueden ser cualquier proveedor, que eso fue una de las grandes oportunidades que nosotros vimos. En Puerto Rico no existen muchos proveedores, especialmente en esta área de credenciales cortos. Este programa a mí me fascina, porque yo sí creo que va a dar un cambio en el ecosistema brutal. Claro. Porque estamos añadiendo una capacidad, una oferta que no existía.
Estamos añadiendo infraestructura al ecosistema que no existe.
Y estamos trayendo proveedores de afuera que vienen a disrupt, como yo llamo, ¿verdad?, a cambiar el juego, a crear una competencia que no existía. Lo que provee esto, que es distinto a lo de la universidad, las personas que no entran a la universidad, esto es una alternativa para ellas. Las personas que están en alguna carrera y quieren hacer un cambio de carrera, esto es una forma bien, no quiero decir fácil, porque todos estos programas son complicados, pero costo efectivo y eficiente de hacerlo.
how the PREPA fiscal plan gets put together, we compile the data from these different agencies. All of the numbers actually get submitted to PREPA, their own needs to operate the system. They then get the estimates from Luma, they get the estimates from Haneda, and then we pull all that together, do the analysis, and that's the fiscal plan. The goal of these numbers is, this is what you would need to reduce the number of outages by 75 to 85% from where they are. Why do you want to do that? PREPA is presently, in terms of reliability, the lowest performing utility in the nation by far. It's not close. So all of this means you want to make sure the people of Puerto Rico deserve to have a utility that is performing and that is reliable. That is number one. So the first priority is all of the resources that you can generate in the rate should go into the system. After you fund the system, if there's left over, you can fund the legacy debt.
El plan fiscal de la Autoridad de Energía Eléctrica, recientemente aprobado por la Junta de Supervisión Fiscal, es una radiografía o un X-ray del sistema eléctrico de Puerto Rico. Esencialmente, el plan fiscal resalta las necesidades reales del sistema, que según las proyecciones que nos dieron los operadores, entiéndase Luma, Genera y la Autoridad de Energía Eléctrica, el sistema necesita más para operación y mantenimiento del sistema. Ya no podemos seguir pensando en quick fixes, en cómo resolver esto a corto plazo. Tenemos que ir pensando ya cómo de verdad podemos llevar al sistema eléctrico de Puerto Rico al nivel que el pueblo de Puerto Rico se merece. Y esa es nuestra obligación. Todos sabemos que se nos va la electricidad o la luz con más frecuencia de la que todos quisiéramos, pero la realidad es que el sistema está peor de lo que imaginamos y hay que atenderlo. Creo que las escuelas de Puerto Rico, los hospitales de Puerto Rico, los residenciales, los pueblos del sur, los pueblos del norte, los pueblos de la isla, del centro de la isla, merecen un sistema energético no solamente resiliente, sino que tú puedas contar. Yo creo que no es justo para nadie en Puerto Rico salir del trabajo, salir de algún lugar, pensando, tendré luz cuando llegue a mi casa. Y eso es lo que el plan fiscal dice. Cuán crítico, cuán débil, cuánto necesita el sistema energético. No dice que la Junta de Supervisión Fiscal va a aumentar la tarifa. No lo dice. Eso es una responsabilidad o poder que solamente tiene el negociado de energía. Este plan fiscal, al igual que todo lo que se han certificado, no es un documento político. Esto refleja la realidad del sistema y resalta la
Yeah, good morning. I am Arthur Gonzalez, the chair of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. I would like to welcome everyone joining us today for the Oversight Board's second public meeting of 2025, which is our 48th public meeting overall, and which is being held virtually by Zoom. Some members are here together in Puerto Rico. Other members are participating via Zoom from other locations. To begin the meeting, I would like to start with a roll call to formally determine if we have a quorum. Dr. Andrew Biggs.
Present.
Mr. Cameron McKenzie.
Present.
Mr. John Nixon.
Present.
Dr. Betty Rosa.
Presente.
Mr. Juan Sabater. Mr. Luis Sarbinas. I am present by Zoom. Ex officio memo Governor Jennifer Gonzalez.
Present.
All right, it appears we have a quorum and the meeting is called to order. As usual, I'd like to ask our General Counsel, Mr. Jaime Alcore, if he would be willing to act as a secretary for this meeting.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We also welcome the Governor's Chief of Staff and Executive Director of FOMB, Francisco Dominici, and as well thank all government officials joining us by Zoom today, as well as everyone watching the live stream of this meeting at the Oversight Board's website. The audio of this meeting is available in English, and there is also a simultaneous Spanish translation. Additionally, the board is being translated into sign language. If you log into English language website, the audio will be in English. If you log into the Spanish website, you will hear the simultaneous translation. As usual, we'll be handling questions and comments from our online participants through a form that is available on our website. You can find this form on the live stream page and complete it by putting your name and address and adding any questions or comments you may have. You can post comments or questions until 15 minutes before the end of the meeting, and we will provide answers on our website. We will also give an opportunity to address any comments we have received toward the end of the meeting. We have the following agenda items for today. Approval of minutes of public meeting and executive session of the Oversight Board. Administrative matters. Update from the Executive Director. Remarks from Governor Jennifer Gonzalez. Overview of federal funds. Public commentary, other matters, and adjournments. Approval of the minutes. The first order of business is to approve the minutes of our last public meeting, which was held on February 25th, 2025. The minutes, are attached to the meeting materials as Appendix A. We will also need to approve the minutes from a series of executive sessions held since that public meeting. Those executive sessions were held on March 7th, March 14th, March 21st, March 28th, April 4th, April 25th, May 2nd, May 6th, 2025. The minutes of the executive sessions are attached to the meeting materials as Appendix B. Are there any questions about the minutes? No response being heard. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Move to approve the minutes of the last public board meeting held on February 25th, 2025, which are attached to the meeting materials as Appendix A, and the minutes of the executive sessions held on March 7th, March 14th, March 21st, March 28th, April 4th, April 25th, May 2nd, and May 6th, which are attached to the meeting materials as Appendix B in the form presented to the meeting.
Thank you, John. Do we have a second?
Sure, I second the motion.
Thank you, Cameron. I'd like to ask for a voice vote. First, all in favor, please say yes.
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 Those opposed, please say no. Any abstentions? All the board members present having voted in favor, the motion passes and the minutes are approved. Next, we have a routine administrative matter. Would someone make the motion?
Mr. Chair, I would like to make the following motion. Between the adjournment of this meeting and the opening of the Oversight Board's next public meeting, the Oversight Board may consider an executive session any and all matters it is authorized to consider under PROMESA, including first, any certification determinations authorized by PROMESA, including certification determinations under Section 206 of PROMESA. Second, any submissions or authorizations authorized by PROMESA. And third, any filings authorized under Title III of PROMESA, in each case that are set forth as part of the vote to convene such executive session. The Oversight Board may also act by unanimous written consent between meetings in accordance with its bylaws, with such consent to include consent by electronic transmission.
Thank you, Andrew. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, John. Would all those in favor please say yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, no further comment being heard. The motion passes. Next, we will move to the substance of the public meeting. I will open the floor to our Executive Director, Robert Mojica, for an overview of the Oversight Board's work since our last public meeting held in February. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Since our last board meeting, the economic and fiscal policy changes being advanced at the federal level of government have moved into sharper focus. And those changes present both challenges and opportunities for Puerto Rico. We are working with the administration of Governor Jennifer Gonzalez Colon and the Legislative Assembly to prepare Puerto Rico for both. We must plan for the changes in fiscal policy that we know are coming, and we must prepare for those that could still be ahead, but are largely unknown. We must also be ready to take advantage of President Trump's goal to bring manufacturing back to the United States from abroad. And Puerto Rico could well benefit from those trade and economic policy changes. Like every government around the nation, state, municipal, and others, less federal funding will be available to Puerto Rico in the coming years, in part because emergency stimulus funding related to the COVID-19 pandemic era are and always were expiring. This much we know. This year's budget and future budgets must reflect this reality. In addition, we must be prepared for additional budget and policy changes in Washington that impact recurring federal funds that the Commonwealth government, like many states and territories, have depended on to fund government services. We are in the process of working with the governor to finalize a responsible budget to submit to the legislature that meets the needs of the people of Puerto Rico. However, since the federal government is still in the process of shaping the federal government's own budget, we must be ready, and this budget is being prepared for an unusual degree of uncertainty. To provide you with some context on our budget development outlook, today our Budget Management Director, Elisa Guardiola, will provide you with an overview of how much of the Commonwealth's budget has relied on federal funding in recent years, and what departments receive a substantial share of their revenue from the federal government. The federal government's decisions to reduce financial support to the states and territories could have a substantial effect on Puerto Rico's Department of Education, for example. Particularly, the loss of elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, ESSER funding, is meaningful. This program was introduced in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, provided funding to states and local educational agencies to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on schools, and was to expire last year. But an extension was granted to Puerto Rico and other states. The federal government recently withdrew these extensions, but we understand that Puerto Rico is working on securing them for longer periods of time. Other states are affected too, from Massachusetts to California, from New York to New Mexico. And whereas Massachusetts is expected to lose $106 million in unspent COVID funding, according to the governor of Massachusetts, more than $500 million is at stake for the Puerto Rico Department of Education. Even if we can keep access to those federal funds longer, we know that these funds and others were always one-time, non-recurring aid. They were never meant to be permanent, and the Puerto Rico Department of Education must have a plan to operate with only recurring funds. Billions in Medicaid funds will also expire in 2027. And we will probably not know for a long time whether Congress would be willing to expand additional Medicaid coverage from the approximately $500 million statutory Medicaid funding that Puerto Rico receives by law. And if so, by how much? We need to be prepared to work with the governor to make sure that the federal government understands the implications for Puerto Rico. We continue to analyze funding for other departments and programs. Puerto Rico has more at stake than most states, given its relatively low median income compared to other states. The reliance on federal funds to support vital public services is more impactful. As a result of the non-recurring disaster relief and COVID-related aid, Puerto Rico is at the top end of U.S. states and territories with the highest share of federal funds as a proportion of its total budget. In the current fiscal year 2025, approximately 50% of the Commonwealth's budget was comprised of federal funds. However, when you remove the non-recurring aid, the Puerto Rico proportion of federal aid drops closer to the average of U.S. states, which is approximately 35%. We sent the government of Puerto Rico several letters in recent weeks to get more information and to understand to what degree the government is planning for the reductions. On March 6th, we asked the Secretary of Education for a breakdown of activities financed with non-recurring federal funds through the end of this and the following 5 fiscal years. The assumptions the projections are based on, and an outline of the potential implications if alternative funding is not secured. We are working with the Puerto Rico Department of Education to analyze the implications of this information. In our response to the government's proposed budget for the coming fiscal year 2026, we highlighted the economic and fiscal uncertainty and the importance of a clear strategy to prioritize which programs and services are most critical. Given the government's reliance on federal funding and the uncertainty, it may be necessary to revisit overall spending levels and resource allocations before or even after the certification of the fiscal year 2026 budget, once there is greater clarity from the federal government. It is clear already that it is not possible to replace the federal funds that expire or could potentially be lost. It is imperative for the government to develop a comprehensive roadmap to transition Puerto Rico towards long-term fiscal responsibility, including financial sustainability, and we are committed to working with the government to develop such a strategy and to address the challenges ahead. And that is why we asked the government to do in our letter last week. Planning ahead is particularly important since the uncertainty around reduced federal funding is coming at a time when the government, the governor, the legislature, and the oversight board must prepare the budget for the coming fiscal year 2026, which starts on July 1. We are working very closely with the governor and our staff and communicating daily on these issues. The governor has provided the oversight board with a timely revised budget, and we are in the process of reviewing this revised proposal. We are planning to send the budget to the legislature next week, and as always, since the oversight board has been in place, Puerto Rico will have a certified budget in full compliance with the fiscal plan no later than June 30. The Commonwealth budget has three parts: general fund for day-to-day operations, special revenue funds for dedicated purposes, and federal funds. This year, 2026 general fund budget target has been set at $13.3 billion, reflecting a 1.5% increase over the current fiscal year's 2025 certified budget, primarily to account for inflation. Additional general fund resources in fiscal year 2026 budget have been largely allocated to non-recurring investments rather than recurring obligations in order to maintain fiscal responsibility in this era of uncertainty. The Oversight Board remains committed to fiscal discipline while preserving flexibility to respond to changing economic conditions and policy developments. Medicaid funding, as I mentioned before, remains one of the most significant long-term risks, but additional risks include broader economic challenges, the fragility of the power grid, inflation, and the importance of maintaining fiscal discipline in a post-restructuring environment. The fiscal year 2026 budget will reflect a measured, responsible approach in an environment of competing priorities, uncertainty, and persistent risk. We continue to see cooling economic growth in Puerto Rico. The outlook of the current and coming fiscal year reflect relatively flat growth compared to prior fiscal years. The updated forecast reflects more recent economic conditions and a more current view of the macroeconomic outlook. To gain more perspective on where the economy is heading, the Oversight Board will be hosting an economic symposium later this month with economists from the mainland and from Puerto Rico, so the government and the public can hear about individual outlooks and perspectives for the U.S. economy as a whole and the Puerto Rico economy specifically. The legislature has kindly agreed to host this public symposium at the Capitolio, and we hope this economic forecasting conference is going to become an annual feature and a fixed element of Puerto Rico's budget process. It will add transparency to the forecasting process, but also a robust exchange of ideas and points of view. Economic and fiscal uncertainty aside, Puerto Rico must be ready for the opportunities. The president's stated goal is to bring manufacturing back to the United States that companies, for various reasons, might have shifted abroad. Pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturing has been the backbone of Puerto Rico's economy, and that offers a unique advantage in the current debate about reshoring. Manufacturing in Puerto Rico is not as strong as it used to be, but the same is true for many different reasons for many parts of the United States and indeed throughout the developing world. But Puerto Rico has muscle. We have a university system that trains excellent engineers, and we have a pharma and device manufacturing companies that continue to produce world-class products here in Puerto Rico. We have brownfields that can be turned into sites for active manufacturing, and based on my conversations with the governor and her administration, I believe we have a government committed to using these tools and seizing the opportunities. The members of the Oversight Board are helping to advance these strategic opportunities, and the fiscal plan has long laid out parameters for Puerto Rico's success in a hyper-competitive world. One key element is tax reform. Puerto Rico must simplify its overly complex tax system. The tax system must become more fair and more efficient and more geared towards stimulating economic growth. The Oversight Board members have engaged in tax reform, and our staff is working with the government on a roadmap for tax reforms. Puerto Rico must reform its education system. Puerto Rico's children deserve a public school system that adequately prepares them for the job markets of the future. We raised teachers' salaries by almost 40% in recent years, and our civil service reform is transforming the administrative backbone of the school system at PRDE. But clearly more needs to be done. We are still at the beginning of the transformation that is needed to gear up the school system to meet the needs of today and tomorrow. And of course, Puerto Rico needs more reliable energy. But for the economic growth to improve and the quality of life for everyone who lives here. We continue on our path to end PREPA's bankruptcy, despite significant resistance from bondholders who have not agreed to support our plan of adjustment. And we continue to work with all the stakeholders of Puerto Rico's energy grid to speed up the recovery and resilience of PREPA's grid and power plants. Once again, it is imperative that we spend the FEMA funds already obligated, already allocated to Puerto Rico to restore and improve the grid as fast as possible. Last year, less than $4 billion of the $17 billion that has been made available to assist in repairing the grid after Maria has been spent. This is not acceptable, and together we must do better. On the debt side, we filed an amended plan of adjustment in March that reflects the projections and findings of the new PREPA fiscal plan that the Oversight Board certified in February. The amended plan eliminates the legacy charge contemplated in previous versions of the plan to repay the significantly reduced debt. And we will be working with the government to identify the source of funds to support the potential cash or bond recovery for creditors proposed in the plan. Thank you, Chairman and board members. Concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Robert. I now turn the floor over to see if there's any questions or comments from board members.
I have some comments on the federal funds, but maybe I'll wait until after.
Yeah.
Fine, John, thank you. But there be no further comment? Excuse me, did I interrupt someone?
No.
No further comment being made. I'd like to turn the floor over to Governor Jennifer Gonzalez, who would like to make some remarks. Welcome, Governor.
Thank you, Judge, and thank you all the members of the board for having us. I'm traveling to Ponce, so that's the reason I'm moving on. But I want to say, first of all, thank you. Since January, we've been working together, having many meetings, almost weekly meetings, and regular calls regarding federal funds, regarding the budget, and regarding all situations regarding the new public agenda of President Trump. So to that regard, I want to say thank you because during the outages of April, we got the opportunity to submit to the board an approval of several items regarding our electrical grid system, and they were approved almost immediately. And I believe this is one of the big, I know we were talking about federal funds, we've been talking about the budget, we've been talking about the decisions of the government of Puerto Rico, the certified budget, among many other things. But I will put on the table what I believe is the biggest priority of the island, which is the electrical grid. We can be talking about education, healthcare, we can be talking about budget, but if we don't have an electric grid that can provide security and reliability to maintain operations of the government and maintain operations of even public manufacturing companies on the island. Will be missing the importance of it. To that end, all of you know the fragility of the system, how weak it is, and we are not talking just about transmission and distribution that we saw firsthand, the lack of maintenance, the lack of cutting vegetation. Finally, we got FEMA approved two of the biggest contracts for two regions on the island regarding cutting vegetation that were submitted since last summer, and we finally got it through. So I will say that the federal administration is doing their part on many of those funds that were waiting for a long period of time. To that end, the other part of the biggest concern we do have is the generation. As you may recall, we are going to be hitting this summer high demand on energy, and we do lack enough generation to meet that demand. For that reason, we amended two laws to provide, to take away and waive intermediate goals regarding energy. That will provide us with the P3 office and Energy SAR Josue Colon since the 25th of March to the 25th of April, the opportunity to open request for proposal for 800 megawatts of temporary generation. That just finished. We received more than 70 companies submitting their proposals. I believe during this week and the next one, we should have P3s making final decisions on which companies are going to be awarded to bring at least 800 megawatts of temporary generation to the island. That's one thing. The other one, of course, is having at least 1,500 megawatts of permanent generation on the island just to meet the demand of this summer. So those are one of the biggest challenges. Today I'm going to be visiting one of the plants that the generation plant was damaged for several months, even years. And I think we're going to have it back today. So that's going to be a major adding some new megawatts that were not in the system, that were not available to sustain the system. So this is a big challenge. We've been having direct conversations with the Secretary of Energy. He understands this issue. We spoke directly in the White House with the President and the cabinet members from EPA to HUD to FEMA, the Homeland Security Director, and many times with the team of the Department of Energy. And I think we should be seeing some efforts to use the federal funds that were awarded when I was in Congress, and we were talking about $18 billion that all of you know that are not being used yet. We may have a different approach from the operator of the system, but I want to say thank you again to Executive Director Mojica for willing to be part of the almost weekly meetings we do have with operators, Genera and Luma. I believe this is one of the biggest challenges. Of course, I know we still got the situation with the PREPA Title III case, and through that end, the government of Puerto Rico and the Oversight Board has collaborated on the PREPA Title III case with PREPA pensions as well, and the financial challenges facing many of municipalities. The last one even was yesterday when we got an opportunity to meet Chairman Gonzalez during the morning and during the afternoon, the executive director to have meetings regarding just the municipality financial challenges. We all have already reached agreements on PREPA pensions and remain committed to a productive working relationship. I know this is not something that we have finalized the decision on how to end the tradition of just giving money from the regular budget to pay the PREPA pensions. As you know, Again, I'm personally involved in overseeing the reconstruction efforts on the island. Um, this is, as you mentioned, there's a lot of federal funds that were awarded to Puerto Rico. Much of them are not being used, and we're talking about city revitalization, CDBGDR, CDBG funds, FEMA funds as well. So all those are been tracking. We've been tracking them directly with the head of the agencies. And one of the biggest change we made since January of this year is changing with some executive orders the permitting process. And I believe this is moving the needle in terms of getting most of the projects out. At the beginning, even if it was a project sponsored and paid by the federal government, the government of Puerto Rico were requiring many permits from many local agencies. So one of the executive orders, and I will submit them for the anyway. You have it for the record. It's waiving local permitting if the projects are sponsored by the federal government, and this is changing the way and the time it is taking for the Department of Economic Development to get those projects running. We've been seeing the difference in hot projects, as well as many other construction projects on the island, as well as implementing new people working with these issues. So we're getting most of them out from the Department of Economic Development. So ensuring the transformation of Puerto Rico should be a top priority. Using those federal funds, we don't want to lose them. Executive Director, we're talking about the money assigned by the federal government during the pandemic to the Department of Education. And as he well said, Puerto Rico was not intending to use those funds on a permanent basis. They were just one time allocation of funds to meet the challenges that we faced during COVID. So we were not expecting to use those funds on a recurrent way. The Secretary of the Department of Education it's taking the measures to not to lose service in many areas. But that's a reality we're going to be facing, not just with the pandemic funding. We're talking about earthquake funding, hurricanes funding, and we should not be living on just emergency federal money for the rest of our days. So that's the reason changing permitting, changing public policy matters. We're talking also about tax reform. We sent almost more than 10 bills during this session, attacking some of the areas, including getting municipalities and the tax system on the same page. Instead of doing individual payments, uniforming the dates, and cutting a lot of the expenses for the government. Of course, the complete tax reform, we will see it during the next session that will begin in August to the end of December. And we will maintain the direct communication with the board to see those bills and make progress on that. The other area I am personally involved is the healthcare issue. As the board just mentioned, we managed a deal while I was in Congress, and that deal is going to be until 2027. So we do have the federal funding for healthcare on the island, receiving the biggest amount of federal funds ever, and I'm grateful for the administration that actually grant that to us during past years in Congress. And we already began meetings with the chairmen of the committee in the House and the Senate administration to open that dialogue again, knowing that we cannot wait until 2027 to begin that discussion. People who are managing this issue right now in the House and the Senate, they do have direct knowledge of the issue. They were working with us while we were in Congress. They came to the island several times, so they understand the issue, and that's good news. Of course, we keep in touch with the administration regarding this and other issues. The other one is manufacturing, and although we've been seeing maybe an international backlash on the tariff that the president is proposing. The reality is that the United States is having a deficit on commercial exchange with many of those countries. So many people may challenge President Trump's idea on how to negotiate those tariffs. But in the case of Puerto Rico, I believe that's a silver lining. We've been prompting to bring manufacturing back to the island, pharmaceutical, biomedical, medical devices. And this is a great opportunity to bring back many of those companies that maybe will be operating in the European Union, in Asia, and many other countries. And to that end, the Secretary of Economic Development and Invest Puerto Rico are working hand by hand, not just to call them, to visit them. We're going to target 50 companies that we're looking to expand operations on the island. Other are going to be new to the island. So we're focusing on following up with those companies in direct communication with the White House and the executive level. The last week promise of President Trump of bringing manufacturing with a public policy of the United States is going to benefit Puerto Rico. And at the same time, we just got a bill in the House filed by Representative Maliotakis, who was a bill I introduced while I was in Congress, giving more incentives to bring manufacturing back home to the United States and, of course, territories and Puerto Rico. So combining those two efforts may be a great tool to literally change the needle of economic development on the island of manufacturing. Again, our biggest challenge is going to be the electrical grid. And that's the reason we are so focused on maintaining that issue as our first in the agenda. I personally believe that reconstruction efforts and working closely with the board and the federal agencies are needed to ensure that funding is deployed efficiently, transparently, and in a way that it addresses the island most urgent needs. That's the reason we're working to that end. I believe that the transformation of the energy grid on the island is a top priority. We're committed to modernizing the grid, ensuring energy affordability and reliability, and those efforts are essential to our long-term economic development and quality of life. So trying to see what other issue you were bringing. I want to say again thank you to the members of the board for approving most of the requests the government of Puerto Rico has been doing during the last months, and again the willingness to the executive director to receive a lot of calls, not just from me but from my cabinet members. So with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board.
Thank you, Governor. Your remarks and participation are always welcome. Would Robert or any board members like to comment on the governor's remarks? No comments being heard. I will turn the floor over to Elisa Guardiola, our Budget Management Director, for an overview of federal funds. Elisa, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, board members, Governor Gonzalez, and all those listening in. Thank you for joining us. Today, I'll provide an overview of the increasing role that federal funding plays in Puerto Rico's budget and its implications for critical public services. I'll walk through historical trends, service area allocations, and the challenges ahead. Puerto Rico is increasingly reliant on federal funds to deliver vital public services and support vulnerable populations. Nearly 50% of the fiscal year 2025 budget is comprised of federal funds as compared to 34% in fiscal year 2017. The increase in federal funds as a share of the total budget in fiscal year 2025 is driven by non-recurring federal funds that support disaster relief, and COVID-19 recovery efforts. It's important to note that 4.9 billion of this amount in fiscal year 2025 is non-recurring, related to disaster recovery and COVID-19 response. Excluding these, the recurring federal share will be about 31%, slightly lower than in fiscal year 2017. Those non-recurring federal funds will not be available in the future years, so there could be the requirement to adjust the budget in the future due to the uncertainty of those funds. Federal funding to Puerto Rico increased beginning fiscal year 2020, primarily due to the funding provided to support hurricane, earthquake, and COVID-19 recovery efforts. Funding was critical to support the reconstruction of infrastructure and housing and to provide continuity to student education needs. The federal funds that are more recurring in nature support critical services to the residents of the island, including healthcare, affordable housing, access to education, and nutrition assistance. The Commonwealth's reliance on federal funding will decline as those non-recurring funds will expire. In addition, the Commonwealth could face a Medicaid fiscal cliff beginning in fiscal year 2028, where it becomes responsible for a significantly higher share of Medicaid expenses. This risk will need to be closely monitored to understand any changes by Congress that could impact the projected Medicaid fiscal cliff in fiscal year 2028. As previously mentioned, Puerto Rico has received non-recurring federal funds in recent years to support reconstruction and education recovery efforts. While funding for those programs has been stable in the past, recent announcement by the federal government on reductions could accelerate reductions across the Commonwealth agencies. In the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in 2017, Puerto Rico's education system faced substantial challenges, including infrastructure damage and resources shortages, which was further impacted by COVID-19. As a result, the majority of non-recurring federal funds received by the Department of Education supported critical recovery efforts that included assistance for teachers' compensation, student supplies, technology, and building repairs. Those non-recurring funds has mostly been spent and are set to expire next year in fiscal year 2026. While the Commonwealth has identified funding to cover certain expenses previously funded by one-time funds, the government may need to make adjustments to the budget to cover the remaining operating expenses that will need to be continued. The federal funds that are recurring in nature will continue to provide enhanced services to students with disabilities, provide access to meals, and support students from disadvantaged and low-income backgrounds. Currently, as a result of income levels, approximately 1.4 million Puerto Ricans rely on Medicaid for healthcare. Puerto Rico's grant allocation has historically been capped by federal legislation at approximately $500 million annually. Recent federal acts have temporarily increased funding through fiscal year 2027. These increases were designed to provide additional relief to the Commonwealth during and following the COVID-19 pandemic, given the rising healthcare needs of the population in Puerto Rico. Beginning fiscal year 2028, the Commonwealth may face a Medicaid fiscal cliff, becoming responsible for a significantly higher share of Medicaid expenses. Since fiscal year 2025, over $250 million annually has been funded by the Commonwealth General Fund to cover operating expenditures previously supported by expiring federal funds. The March 1st, 2025 government budget submission considers $276 million funded by the Commonwealth General Fund to cover operating expenditures as previously supported by expiring federal funds. These costs include salary increases provided to teachers and public safety positions, including correctional officers, firefighters, paramedics, and dispatchers. In addition, students' transportation needs have been funded. While certain costs have been covered, there are additional risks that will need to be carefully monitored. These risks include federal executive orders announcing grant reductions and terminations that could impact Commonwealth agencies, potential expiration of ESSER funds impacting the Department of Education, as previously mentioned, the Medicaid fiscal cliff. Continued coordination between local and federal authorities will be crucial to ensuring stability and sustainable progress. Given the evolving funding risks, the fiscal year 2026 budget certification process plays a critical role in understanding the Commonwealth's financial position, planning for the changes in fiscal policy, and ensuring that resources are allocated responsibly in an environment of competing priorities and ongoing uncertainty. On May 1st, the government of Puerto Rico submitted a revised proposed budget for the fiscal year 2026 in response to the notice of violation. The Oversight Board is currently reviewing the submission. The next key milestone is next Monday, when the Oversight Board will submit the general fund budget to the legislature. The board will continue working closely with both the government and the legislature throughout the remaining of the budget process. That concludes my presentation, and thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Robert or any board member have any questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have some comments that I'd like to make regarding the federal funds and the current budget situation that we're finding ourselves in. As a former budget director, we've seen a lot of changes in federal funds over the years. And I think it's important to really note the dynamic that we're in right now. Elisa talked about the federal changes in federal funding that we know about, right? The fiscal cliff, the termination of all the stimulus funds, and the Commonwealth is dealing with those, as is every other state in the United States. So there's a reduction of the federal money, but also on top of that, they're kind of a perfect storm, because on top of that, we have what's going on with the federal government with the DOGE committee and the need to come up with the $4 trillion to extend the president's tax cuts and all of the different initiatives that are coming on with it by the Trump administration, which are all going to also result in a reduction of federal money to the states and to the territories. So when Elisa says that we may have to adjust the budget, I think it's an absolute, we will definitely have to adjust the budget. And I think people need to really understand that these could have some major impacts in the federal funds that are coming to the island and might have some pretty dramatic changes. I think it's important to note that a lot of state legislatures have finished their business, and some are in the process of wrapping them up. But given the timing of the budget reconciliation bill in Congress, many states are going to have to come back, and they know they're going to have to come back and readjust the budget once they know what's coming from the federal government. So the timing's a little bit out of whack. We have to certify the budget based on the state fiscal year, which ends June 30. The federal fiscal year ends September 30. And so we will have to make some modifications. And again, Puerto Rico is not unique in this case. Every state in the union and the territories as well are going to have to deal with these issues. So this is not something that's isolated to Puerto Rico, although I think that it's magnified here in Puerto Rico with all of the stimulus money and the reconstruction money that's come to the island. So this is something that's going to not be the most pleasant experience, but I think that those who are receiving federal money need to be prepared and be thinking about how we can quickly make adjustments to the budget, because we will need to be doing that. Obviously, we need to keep the budget in balance, and it's not uncommon during times of changes in federal funding or different funding levels that states and territories have to come in and readjust the budgets based upon that. So my anticipation, while we'll certify this budget next month, I think that we will definitely be back to the table later this summer once the federal government and Congress passes the budget reconciliation bill. I know there's talk that they want to get that done by Memorial Day, and if that happens, obviously, then that would be within the timing of us certifying this budget, but I'm not willing to bet. Maybe I would be willing to bet my board honorarium on that. But otherwise, I would not put any real money towards that, just because I think that it's going to take a lot of big issues. And when you talk about the Medicaid cliff, that's the Medicaid cliff as of current law. But what we do know is that they're trying to come up with another $880 billion over the next 10 years in Medicaid reductions. Whether they'll get there, I don't think so. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to get there. But obviously, there's a lot of game left to be played, and we just need to make sure that we're prepared and are proactive in dealing with these changes. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, John, for your insights and comments. Anyone else wish to be heard? I think as John, it might be as John stated it, we will continue through Robert and his staff's efforts and working with the government to prepare for a more dire outcome, but continue to hope for the best. And I think that's the approach we need to take under the circumstances. Any further comments at all? With that, I would like to thank Robert, our staff, Governor Gonzalez, and her administration, and all of you for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be handling any additional comments or questions through the oversight website. I apologize. I jumped over one matter. Do we have any public commentary to address before we bring in?
Yes, Chairman Silvet here. We have received a couple of questions in the public commentary, all related to the classification remuneration plan for tourism, DTOP, and UPR. And we will be responding to all these questions on our website. That will be all.
Thank you very much. I apologize for jumping over that. As I said, I would like to thank all those I mentioned. Does any board member have any other matter to discuss today? Since we have no other matters to cover, do I have a motion to adjourn this meeting?
I'll move that we adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, John. Any seconds?
I'll second.
Thank you, Andrew. All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All of the board members present having voted in favor, the meeting is now adjourned. We will have a press conference following this later this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Live.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos. We'll start our press conference. First question, you can raise your hand or write in the chat box. I think Luis Guardiola had one question. Luis, when you're ready, you can start.
Buenos días, saludos.
Good morning. Hello. I know that we talked about. Yes, I can hear you. We discussed, or it was discussed. Let's go to the next question while we get the audio. Let's go. Yes, I think we can hear Luis. Yes, go ahead. There was discussion about tax reform and working with the government, but in this panorama that has been painted regarding a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the topics of federal funds and Puerto Rico's needs of having them in order to provide essential services. When we talk about reducing taxes or import taxes for vehicles, automobiles, for example, to stop the impact of tariffs, among other sources, is that consistent with the panorama of uncertainty that you have painted, or should we discard that?
The budget has two parts to it, right? The revenue side and the spending side. And you're right. If you're talking about reductions in taxes, you could need those revenues to fund essential services. However, the current tax system doesn't promote economic growth. And there are reforms to the tax system that don't necessarily result in less revenue. It's restructuring the system to make it more fair. It's restructuring the system so that it's geared more towards economic growth. If there's a reduction overall in revenues, then yes, you have to consider that in light of the federal landscape that we're facing. But what we don't want to do is not have the conversation because we are dealing with this federal uncertainty. The reality is that the reforms and those proposals will take time. So working with the government to see what options we have with regard to tax reforms, right, whether or not that results in reductions in revenue, right, is part of the story. And the reality that probably will not happen in this fiscal year because it's going to take some time, and the governor had set aside some committees with regard to this that will report back right in the summer or fall of next year. So we want to continue constructively having that conversation, even though we're facing right this economic climate, because there are aspects of the current taxing system that prevent growth from happening, and we at least need to have that analysis and have that discussion.
Entendí bien que entonces la reforma.
So if I'm understanding that reform wouldn't come into play until the next fiscal year. Well, Luis, hello, and Cameron Mackenzie here. I think that the message that we're trying to communicate is that what we're looking at is not necessarily reducing what is being received, but rather to create a tax system whose north is making sure that we can keep receiving the same funds that are being received, but in a way that promotes economic growth. Now, when is that tax reform going to be executed? That depends on various factors, including what the receptivity of the different parts. It's going to be attempted, but we have to see when it's going to be executed. I have a second question. It's a bit more for the long term. How does this uncertainty, how do you think it will delay Puerto Rico's exit or Promesa's exit from the supervision or control from the board for Puerto Rico to go back to the markets and for things to normalize? Do you think this would delay the process, or what Promesa aims to do? Well, Luis, I think that one of the most important things that is being worked on is on having an ERP system, an accounting system that practically brings more clarity to the financial statements of the government. And I would say that without a doubt, that is one of the most important things, and it would facilitate the board's exit out of Puerto Rico. I've said it publicly. I don't want there to be an oversight board in Puerto Rico, but at the end of the day, until the goals are achieved, there are greater chances of falling back into this type of process. It's been a painful process for many Puerto Ricans, including members of the board. So the delay or no delay will depend on decisions made by the government, how they work with it, and in what way they can avoid the impact, and in one way or another, take action. I think those would be my points, but I'm sure that Robert might want to add something.
Cameron was just saying, part of the reality of Promesa was during an economic downturn, during tough economic times, responsible decisions weren't made, which resulted in the bankruptcy. What we are doing now and working with the government is, as in our ERP is one example that Cameron mentioned, is how do you create systems and processes and a knowledge base to manage the budget responsibly in any economic climate. If there's lack of federal funds, you have to make the tough decisions. If the economy is growing, you need to make changes to the tax system. Do it responsibly. Don't grow the budget by 10% a year if your revenues are only growing by 2%. This just means we need to manage the budget better. We are right now working very closely with the governor on managing this budget, recognizing that there are headwinds as a result of federal funding, and we're going to have to create a budget that manages within how much we have. So it doesn't mean that this is going to set back that process. It will be critical that we do enact and maintain a responsible budget this year so that it is balanced within the revenues that we have and within whatever happens with the federal fundings. So this is part of what Promesa was supposed to do. Restore fiscal responsibility. We're in a challenging time. The federal funds that are one time are now going away. We always knew that was happened. How will we manage that? Potentially there's a loss of other federal funds. How will we manage that without going into debt, living within the revenues? That's what we're going to work with the government. That's what we will work with the government of Puerto Rico on, and we should be able to get past that. And that will actually show, can we manage the budget together in a responsible way where the legislature passes the budget bills that are responsible and within the resources that we have. So it only would set you back if there is not an acknowledgement of what the fiscal reality is, and you want to go back to not making responsible decisions. Right now, the indications are that everyone recognizes what is, and we should be able to have a responsible budget this year.
Can I just add some things to that, Robert? You're exactly right. There's one thing that's certain in government, and that's that you have different economic cycles, right? You have boom cycles, you have recession cycles, and you have periods of more money, periods of less money. So it's something that's going to be ongoing into the future. So again, it's how does the government and how does the board react to the current fiscal situation? If we can get it solved, that shouldn't prolong things, but these are reasons why it's important for us to have budget stabilization funds and reserve funds, and so we can operate in a rational way. The issue is Puerto Rico has not been operating rationally for many, many decades. And so as quickly as we can get these financial practices in place, we'll be able to set Puerto Rico on a path to sustainability. And that should not have, the current situation shouldn't have any bearing, because the board, working with the government, will make sure the budget's in balance. But there are going to have to be some tough decisions made.
Thank you, John. Next question will be Michelle Kasky, Bloomberg. Michelle, can you hear me? Okay, next question. Alex, are you on? Cyber
Sí,
News?
estoy listo.
Yep, I'm ready. I'm ready. Okay, so since you touched on the subject of PREPA and the situation with the bondholders and the debt, I would like to know, in terms of the situation that's going on with the government in terms of looking for a different operator, do you agree with some people in the private industry that the process would be complicated? Secondly, I would like to know what you think about the proposal of going back to the model that we had with PREPA, because there's no private operator that can manage distribution and generation. Well, as a Puerto Rican who lives here, I wouldn't like to go back to the model that we had before. I'm going to say that right off the bat. That's my opinion. I'm not speaking in representation of the board when I say this. Now, regarding the first part of the question, I think, Rob, I think you're in the best position to answer it.
Around changing the operators, reviewing the contracts, the governor is reviewing it. No one is happy with the state of the electric grid as it is. But let's understand that the state of the electric grid, it did not get to this state in the last 3 or 4 years. It is decades in the making. So, to answer your last part of your question, first, do you want to go back to the system that resulted in an electrical grid that is collapsing, deteriorating faster, and that requires tens of billions of dollars to fix itself because of lack of decision making that occurred for the previous 20 or 30 years? The current operator clearly may not be performing the way it should or the way people of Puerto Rico expect them to perform. They need to be held accountable. There are lots of reasons. You say they're reasons, you say they're excuses. For the people of Puerto Rico, it doesn't really matter. What we do know is we're sitting on $17 billion in funds that are not in the grid. Who is responsible for those funds not being in the grid? The grid would be in a much better position, arguably, if $17 billion had been spent over the last few years to improve the grid. And I think everyone would see those improvements. That has not happened. Who's responsible for that? We need to figure out how to make that happen, how to get those funds that have been allocated to us and could potentially be at risk if we don't spend them and get them deployed. The operators, Genera, Luma, also have to be held accountable for it. But let's remember the grid, this is a decades in the making. It has to be fixed. If there is a desire to find an alternative operator, the government's going through that process, having committees, looking at what alternatives there are, and we will look at all alternatives because what we want is the best operator for the people of Puerto Rico. But let's not, because there's distance and time that's happened, let's not forget how we got here, what happened, all the bad decisions, the politicization, the corruption, and everything else that was happening with the previous operator. Because it'll be on all of us if we go back to what happened before and don't move forward. So current operators need to be held accountable. If there's an alternative, we should be open to entertaining that alternative. In the meantime, we need to get the dollars that are there deployed, and we need to get that money into the grid, and we need to make the improvements. And I think the governor is working on that. She's committed to that. She said that that's her number one priority when she spoke today. It is ours as well. So we're having conversations with them about what the options are. I think we all have the same goal in mind, is to stabilize the grid and get the funding that is required into the grid. That is also why the board has its position with regard to Title III, because we know, right, how much is needed to invest in the grid, and that makes it difficult to have extra money to pay the bondholders.
Rob, y Alex, no sé si
Alex, I don't know if in the fiscal and purpose fiscal plan, you can see one of the biggest problems is that the money that's coming in, the money that's being received from our people who are paying their bills is not enough to maintain operations. And we're seeing that. So what we need to be looking for right now is in which way we can reduce the load, reduce the expenses so that the money that we have lasts. We discussed this in a strategy meeting. One of the problems is vegetation. Sometimes you can literally mitigate that with the same people if they see that in their homes vegetation is getting close to distribution and transmission lines, eliminate those hurdles. But my point is that it's hard to have the system that we want if the funds that we are receiving are not enough. So I don't want to make excuses for anyone. You need to assume the actions of your decisions, but I think that we need to ensure that we can maximize every dollar that we have. And us as the people of Puerto Rico, we need to look for how we can alleviate that load, that burden, because I agree with the governor. If without a good electric system, it's going to be very complicated to promote the island's economic development. So I think that's my all the comments that I have regarding that. Thank you, Cameron. Next question.
Pedro.
Sí, buenos días.
Yes, good morning. Continuing with Luma's topics, I would like to know what the board's position is regarding what the operator said, asking for a credit line for capital investments and repairs to the electric grid.
Said, or actually the Energy Czar said, we don't want to put more money into a system without seeing results. It's the same position that we have. We want to see results. That's the key. So it's not just putting more money, it's to put more money in so that we can see results. If the federal money takes longer to come in, or there's delays, or there's a process that takes a year for reimbursements, that doesn't work for the people of Puerto Rico. What we would like to ensure is that the slowness of the money is not what's causing the delays in the improvements happening. So if the improvements can happen faster because there's money available, we need to do that analysis. But we need to know that there's a plan that's going to do it. This is just, I'm talking about the federal funds. So it's about advancing the federal funds. If the federal funds take longer and there's not enough liquidity to deal with that, we should look at that. But the operator is responsible for making sure that it has submitted all of the required documentation to FEMA, everything that it needs in order to make the reimbursements. And if they're responsible for the slowness happening, then it's on all of us. It's on the government, it's on P3, it is on PREPA, and it is on the operators, all of us to figure out how can we make sure that we're getting the money as quickly as possible. But what we can't do is say that the process and the slowness is going to result in projects not happening, improvements not being made. So only for that reason would we be open to providing liquidity to make sure that projects are happening, that we're advancing money that we know is going to come for the federal government. So, because the people of Puerto Rico have waited too long. And they don't like to hear the excuses of, it's this farm, it's FEMA's fault, it's PREPA's fault, it's Court 3's fault, it's LUMA's fault. We just need results, and we need to execute. And if liquidity is part of that challenge, then we need to be open to providing that with all the safeguards and all the accountability that we need to put on the operator in order to do that.
Gracias.
Thank you, Robert. Pedro, do you have any other questions? Yes, I would like to know how, when evaluating the budget, how are you managing the variable of a possible emergency tariff for the electric service as part of the review on tariffs that the Energy Bureau is doing right now? Thank you.
The budget that we're working on right now is the Commonwealth budget. So what's happening with regard to PREB and the rate case, it's moving separately. They're asking for the information, they're asking for what the costs are, they're doing their evaluations, they push that, the date of the submissions through July. It doesn't impact the Commonwealth's budget overall, but this is the case, this is the point about, is there a liquidity issue? But that wouldn't, it's not part of the Commonwealth's budget that we're discussing right now.
Manuel Guillama, Nuevo Día, you're next.
Sí, saludos.
Yes, hi. Also regarding the issue of the electrical grid, some of the things that Luma is saying, alleging that lack of liquidity in order to be able to make improvements on the system for months. They've been talking about the transfers that PREPA is not making monthly. What is the board's position in terms of whether PREPA or Luma are not complying with their contractual obligations in that regard? And the government response is that Luma is not complying with having the necessary liquidity to guarantee, that liquidity in revenue. I would like to know what the board's position is regarding the arguments that both parties have made.
There is a real controversy between Luma, the operator, and PREPA and Core 3, and PREPA and P3 and the government with regard to the fact that there are hundreds of millions of dollars that are outstanding in reimbursements from the federal government that have been laid out. And essentially, who's it being laid out? It's really being out by the ratepayers. So that money is out. We don't have access to those funds until we get reimbursed. That needs to get resolved. That means that everyone, P3, Luma, Core 3, federal government, need to figure out if we're out $500, $600 million that has not been reimbursed, how do we get that money reimbursed? Because that money is not for Luma. It is to go back into the grid to make the improvements that we need to get made. And the back and forth, while it's important for legal reasons, and the letters that go back and forth, people have to say what they need to say to protect their legal cases. The bottom line is that we need action, and whoever's fault it is that we haven't gotten reimbursed, we need to get reimbursed. We need that money back into the grid, and we need to spend it as quickly as possible. This goes back to the issue we have $15 billion still unspent, or $14 billion still unspent. And we don't have the capacity to lay out that money and then get reimbursed. So it really is, and I've worked in this space for a while. It's never as clear as this person didn't submit the form, but it didn't have this piece of information attached, and it didn't have this letter attached, and then they send it back, and then they send it back. And that's the normal part of bureaucracy. But here in Puerto Rico, that bureaucracy is resulting in 4 or 5 years later, a grid that doesn't have billions and billions of dollars in it. And we need to figure out why that is. So what I would say is, and what we're doing, is we're sitting with the governor's office, PREPA, P3, Luma, Genera in the room, project by project. How do we get the reimbursements? How do we get the money to flow? How do we get more trucks, more construction, more improvements happening faster than the current rate? So, we can go back and forth about who's to blame, that's to blame, and we'll deal with that in due order, and the governor has her committees. But in the meantime, it's unacceptable to just wait until these things are resolved. We have to help all of us together, work together to make sure that the dollars are spent and the money is reimbursed. And if there's a need for liquidity in order to do that, and that's part of the solution and the government agrees with that, we need to do that too. But what the government has said is we're not going to give more money unless we see results, unless we're able to hold them accountable, and we 100% agree with that.
Y en ese aspecto, si se me permite un breve.
And given that, if I may follow up, because it's been months of meetings with the different parts, with the operators, the government, is there still no diagnosis and following that as solution on what is holding up the reimbursements?
For example, that the federal government, we've been talking about vegetation and we've been talking about the obstacles to getting that approved and the slowness. And recently the federal government approved and obligated a couple thousand miles. That money then, once it's approved, it then gets spent slowly, unless, because the federal government only will give you a certain amount at a certain time. Perhaps there's a way that we can accelerate that and get that money spent. As far as the diagnostic overall, there's clearly not enough money flowing into the system, but that's PREB is doing that evaluation right now. PREB is in charge of the rate. PREB is doing the rate case. But what we do know, and P3 has mentioned this, is that there hasn't been, the budget that was already approved for the operators has not been fully funded because the rate only supports that budget, but the rate also assumes that we're going to be getting federal money reimbursed. That's been slow to happen, so as a result, there's money that's been laid out, and we haven't got that money back. Now, we can sit there and wait for that money to come, or we can decide to do something else and get things going while we're waiting for that money to come. So the governor's super committed to this. We are as well. We have been meeting, and there is progress. There is progress being made, but as you know, you make one step forward, one step back. We're talking about the transmission side, and as the governor mentioned, then we have power plants that went out or offline. So we're not going to have enough generation for the summer unless something else is done. That's on the generation side. Why did that happen? I go back to the first point. Because of decades of lack of investment, decades of allowing the generation assets to deteriorate to the point where the average generation legacy asset in Puerto Rico is over 40 years old compared to 12 or 15 years old in the States. The system simply needs to get rebuilt. That's it.
Robert, we need to speed up a little bit because we have a couple of questions. Next, it will be Oscar, then Rafaeli, John Marino, and Michelle. Oscar, you're next, please. Oscar, ¿me escuchas? Yes. Por favor.
Okay. Buenos días.
Good morning, everybody. I have a couple of questions. I'm going to ask them all at the same time and then answer it as you will. So, two things about energy. First, how is the status of emergency tariffs to cover the pensions? That's in the air a little bit, and I don't know if that's solved, how the pensions are going to be paid, or if there's going to be an emergency fee or tariff. Number two, how are we going to identify the repayment of debts that are not involved in that? We've talked about sources for payment that are not involving that tariff. And lastly, when you ask the government for a plan to unwind the federal funds, what volume and what timing are you considering? Are you asking the government to operate completely without federal funds? Is it a less percent? And what time? Is it next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years?
Pensions, we're still working with the government on pensions. We approved a loan and a second loan, right, to make sure that the pension payments get made. And the board wants to make sure that the 12,000 retirees continue getting their payments. The government also understands that the government doesn't have the resources to fully support pensions over the long term. There was supposed to be a provisional rate. That didn't happen. That got moved to July. So we're still looking at what the options are with regard to pensions, but we want to make sure that there's continuity in the meantime, right? And the governor mentioned this as well, right? We can't just keep kicking the can down the road. We have to come up with a permanent solution. Ongoing discussions there. With regard to the funding for the Title III and to pay the bondholders, also, we're in the middle of the budget process presently, right now. So by the time this budget process ends, working with the government and legislature, we hope to be able to segregate sufficient funds or identify the funds and set them aside for the Title III and the settlements that we already have. And as far as federal government unwinding, let me be clear because there's a little confusion. We are not saying that the government needs to operate without federal funds. Like we saw in the presentation that was made earlier, consistent with other states and territories, the average reliance is about 34%. Puerto Rico went up to about 50% because of disaster aid and because of one-time funding. Those funds expire. They were always going to expire. The plan that we're asking for the government is this should have been anticipated all along. We knew those funds were going to expire. So you just need to plan for how you're going to operate without those temporary funds. You're still going to have, right, unless something changes in Congress, you still have the third of the budget that will be supported by the recurring federal funds, and we assume that that continues in the budget. If that doesn't continue, we'll have to have a different conversation. We'll have to reopen the budget and deal with that. But right now, what the budget assumes is the one-time federal funds that were always going to expire will expire, and we need to have a plan to do that, like every other state and territory has to have a plan to do that, because every state had one-time federal funds that also expire. They might expire a little sooner than was anticipated, but they're always going to expire. The rest of the federal funds, the plan is you continue assuming what we know so far, and if there's a change, we'll then come back and revisit. But there is no plan being requested from the government on how you would operate government in the absence of federal funds, because right now we're assuming that the third of the federal funds that were there will continue to be there, with one caveat. We know Medicaid is that part of the funds expire, and we're going to have to be very vigilant to watch what Congress does there.
Gracias, Robert. Rafeli.
Thank you, Robert.
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everybody. Specifically, given that it's an analysis process for the budget that was submitted in May, what part of that budget has the greatest risk of suffering cuts that would affect essential services? I know this was discussed briefly, but I wanted to ask for more specificity in regards to how much.
It's relatively flat. There are one-time increases, but there are no cuts to essential services anticipated in this budget right now, because the only reductions that we're seeing are the one-time federal funds that go away. Those should not be funding essential services because those were always going to be one-time funds. What we're asking for is the Department of Education to make sure we can see what the plan is to do without those funds. But we are not proposing cuts to essential services in this budget.
Hey, Robert, can I just add to that? So, we talked about the federal funding. This would not be board action, right? Most of these reductions would be coming passed on from the federal government, right? And the federal money specifically tied to particular programs. So, we'd have to determine what the impact is to the economy if there was a loss of federal money. But as the federal government tries to go through its efforts, and if they do pass along reduced funding to the particular states or to the territories, especially Puerto Rico in this case, that would be the federal government who's actually reducing the federal services that are flowing through to the island. So wouldn't be action that we would be taking as a board, rather other than just implementing those pass-through reductions that are coming from the federal government.
John, thank you for that, because I want to be very clear. There are no board reductions in this budget. The only things that we're talking about here is federal funding may be reduced or federal funding was expiring. So we have to manage with that reality, like every other state and territory has to manage with that reality. But in the absence of that, there are no reductions being made from the board, from the government, or from resources that are coming from the local taxes.
Along that same line, that Mr. Nixon mentioned, specifically about the policies that Trump and Doge have established. What's your opinion about the creation of a local Doge in Puerto Rico, and how do you think that a structure like that should be financed within the context of so many budget cuts that we're seeing?
Yo veo la...
Hi, Rafeli. I see the creation of a local Doge as a positive thing, because in times of uncertainty, you need to see where we could be more effective and efficient. That's never a negative thing. That's what every business person is doing around the world. They're focusing on how can we do more with less. So I see a local Doge as a positive. In regards of how that will be financed and where the money for that will come from, we need to talk about that, because in theory, as long as those expenses are somewhat reflected in efficiency on other areas, our perspective remains revenue neutral. So in my opinion, I see a local Doge as a positive, as a step in the right direction in order to have a Puerto Rico that's competitive, not only on a national level, but also on an international level as well.
I'm letting the translator do it instead of trying to translate it myself. A couple of thoughts on that. One is there are several states that have created local Doge type groups. The unique thing about Doge is it's not a new concept, right? The way they're doing it is new, but I've personally been part of many efficiency groups or committees or initiatives between gubernatorial transitions, right? I know that those of us with state experience here have lived through those. What we've never seen before is really the manner by which they're doing it. And the impacts, right, the broad-based impacts. So I think as far as your question about a local Doge committee, I think as Board Member McKenzie said, I think it's always important for us to be determining how we can optimize and improve government services, right? I mean, the taxpayers here in Puerto Rico are the people that are being impacted by the inefficiencies and the ineffectiveness of the government. And so can we do things better? Can we do things smarter? Those are things that we really, really want to be talking about, right? But as of right now, we're just trying to get some of the financial best practices in position. But obviously, this is something that the elected officials, the governor, and it's really a question for her about how to streamline government and make things more effective. But the board's number one objective is to make sure that we have a balanced budget, that we're operating in a rational manner, and that we've created an opportunity for economic growth here on the island so we don't slip back into bankruptcy, right? We're negotiating. We just negotiated some pretty big deals with the Commonwealth bankruptcy. Hopefully we'll get PREPA done here in the near future. But again, if the whole economy falls apart and government reverts back to its old ways, it could create some efficiencies or some problems with the way the government responds and lives up to the commitments that we're making. So it's really important that we install these best practices and we operate as effectively as we can.
Y por último, bajo este panorama.
Lastly, under this uncertain scenario, would the board support downsizing the government of Puerto Rico?
Since PROMESA has been enacted, right, there has been changes in the amount of funding that the government was spending. You have to remember that prior to PROMESA, for 16 consecutive years, the government was spending more than they were taking in revenues every year. So basically, you had an operating deficit every year for 16 years. And we only go back 16 years because that's the only data that we have. That results in the bankruptcy. Since then, reductions had to be made in funding. Some of them were painful. And we're on the other side of that. So the last couple of years, now we're paying debt service again. We've right-sized pensions. We're paying for pensions now. We're doing PAYGO. And we're funding services. Going forward, the biggest challenge right now is going to be where there are additional investments that need to be made, but that now has to be slowed because we now have this issue with the federal funds. And if the federal funds are a third of the budget or 50% of the budget, then right before we do new spending or spending increases, we need to understand that landscape more. And if there are any reductions that need to be made, it's going to be because of federal fund reductions. That would cause the government to either have to reduce services or find some other revenue streams. But it's not because we've managed the budget working with the government up until now in a place that is stable. The economy has to grow. And we're facing not just the federal funding cuts, but also potential economic headwinds. But as of right now, what we're waiting for, and anything that has to happen in the budget is going to be tied to the federal cuts. Could the government always be more efficient? Yeah, I think that is why the governor proposed, her executive order in relation to finding savings. And as Board Member Nixon mentioned, every government is always doing that. You're always having to find efficiencies and making sure that you're using the resources that you have best to be able to deliver services.
Gracias, Robert.
Thank you, Robert. Cameron? Yeah, if in regards of your question, Robert summarized it extremely well, but I want to answer something in a more humane way, a humanist way. When when you're talking about downsizing, we're talking about layoffs. And I would say that generally speaking, having to lay off government employees, that's something that is never seen as a positive way, and it's not something that we're looking to do. But at the same time, I want to be clear that if there are positions in the government that are really not needed, that is an indirect cost on Puerto Ricans. The way we see it is that we need to try more fiscally responsible in order to have a prosperous, thriving Puerto Rico that can compete. Now, the question about downsizing the government, that's something that the governor has to answer. And the creation of this local DUDGE, that would be, I assume, the body that would be in charge of finding those efficiencies and where cuts need to be made if there is an unnecessary burden on consumers, individuals, and Puerto Rican businesses. I just wanted to add that. Thank you, Cameron.
More questions. Joe Marie next, and then Michelle Kasky, and we need to wrap up.
Okay, thanks. Real quickly, just to follow up on Oscar's question about the pensions. Am I to understand the board has approved Commonwealth loans for the month of May and June, or plan to do so, and that a rate would be imposed in July to fund the pensions? And the second thing, board member Nixon, put forth a possibility of a need to amend the budget later in the year. Is the board foreseeing a need to do that with other fiscal plans as well, given the uncertainty in federal funding?
On the pensions, we still have to deal with June. We're dealing with it a month at a time. We're in conversations with the government about how to do, right, a permanent solution. There was supposed to be a provisional rate in July that is now not happening. So we're looking at, right, what are the options, how you move forward, right? We need to understand that the rate of spend is $300 million a year. And in light of everything that we're talking about, it's really hard to find $300 million a year, right, to fund the pensions. But PREB at the end, right, is doing their process. And at the end, they're supposed to be looking at all costs, all the costs of the systems and doing their rate case, but that's going to take longer potentially. So 1 month at a time with regard to the loans, while we continue to have conversations with the government on the rate, on the long-term funding options. With regard to other fiscal plans, the federal funds are largely impacting the Commonwealth fiscal plan. So that is where there would be the biggest impact, because if you're talking about direct federal funds, we're not talking about the impacts or the broader economic impacts of those. So as of now, all right, and we're not talking about the fiscal plan, we're talking about the budget. And if you would have to reopen the budget, it would be tied to the loss of federal funds, period.
Next question, Michelle Kasky.
Hi, thank you.
Yes.
Great, thanks. I've got a couple questions. First is, I know you were talking about how, Robert, you were talking about how there's the budget discussions that are going on now. The Commonwealth is, is working on the budget, and in terms of finding the money for the Commonwealth to help support repaying the PREPA's legacy debt, you said that, if I remember correctly, you were saying that that would be worked out in the budget discussions for the Commonwealth's budget. I'm wondering, how soon do you need to explain to the court, to the bankruptcy court, how the PREPA's legacy debt will be repaid? I understand that PREPA and the board have notified the court that it would amend the debt restructuring proposal to explain that. I'm just wondering, is there some sort of time frame where you have to explain that to the court, give that detail to the court? And then also my other question was, in terms of the recurring federal funds, and it looks like this year for fiscal 2025 was 10.4 billion of recurring federal funds. I'm wondering how much you anticipate that will decrease or could decrease for the next fiscal year for the Commonwealth. And then with Medicaid, the anticipation is that it would fall to, the federal government's help would fall to about 1.4 billion in, I believe that's fiscal 27 or 28, yeah, 28. So is it correct to say that if the federal government were to reduce Medicaid funding even more, that there's a risk that that $1.42 billion number would lower even more?
Yeah. You go backwards. The $1.4 billion number, it's because the Medicaid funding crosses over fiscal years. So that's the 27 impact, and then in 28 it actually would drop down to 500. And that's because it's under current law. That's what would happen. Mm-hmm. Puerto Rico has not seen that low of a number in a very long time, but that's current law. So unlike the states that have a federal funding formula for Medicaid that is permanent, because Puerto Rico does not, we drop down to that $500 million level. So we're in a unique position with regard to that funding. And then there's the broader talk of Medicaid reductions writ large. But for Puerto Rico, you had that concern even before there was talk about closing the federal budget deficit because it expires. But your numbers are, it actually goes down to 500 in 28, because it crosses over, the reduction crosses over 2 fiscal years. I don't have a date to tell you as to when we have to tell the court where the funds are coming from. We disclosed that we were going to be finding it from other resources. We're confident that we'll be identifying the funds from other resources. We've had preliminary conversations with the government on that, but when we have to set it aside and tell the court where it's coming from, we will do that. But we're confident that we have the resources to do that. And I think you had a another question in there?
Yeah, a follow-up on that is, what makes you confident that the Commonwealth has the resources and that both the executive branch, the governor, and the legislature will follow through with this?
Yeah. We have had conversations with them, so we understand. The debt has to be paid. The question is how it gets paid. What we said in the fiscal plan is there isn't sufficient in the room in the rate to support all of the investments that the failing grid needs, and also to fund the agreements that we have with 44% of the bondholders. The money is the same. Either you're going to have to pay for it through the rate, or you're going to have to pay for it from some other place. It's the same people, right? You're paying it on 1 million households who have energy bills, or it's coming from some other place that we might be able to find resources that the Commonwealth has access to. So the level of confidence comes from knowing what resources are available and what conversations we have had. And we know that it's critically important for the government as well as the board to be able to exit Title III. So it's important that we're able to fund those commitments so that we have a plan that is confirmable.
Okay.
Robert?
And then the federal funds.
We need to wrap out, Michelle, so.
Okay.
Can I just say one thing, Sylvette, with respect to federal funds? I want to make sure that people understand we're not advocating for a reduction of federal money. We just want to be prepared for what may or may not happen, right? I mean, I think it's important that people are communicating to the federal government and to the congressional leaders and those who are going to be voting on these bills the real impacts that these are going to have, that their actions are going to have on the lives of Puerto Ricans, right? Particularly in Medicaid. I know that a lot of states are doing that. So I'm not calling for advocacy, but I do think, well, I guess maybe I am, right? I mean, these could have some significant impacts. The bottom line is what the point I was trying to make and am trying to make is that we know that changes are coming and we need to be prepared for those changes, but we really don't know where they're going to come or how Congress is going to reconcile this. So we're just watching it proactively, but with those changes, we're quite confident that we're going to have to deal with them as all the other states are preparing to have to deal with them once Congress acts.
Yeah. John makes a valid point. I just want to follow up on it. The history of the Commonwealth budgeting is not acknowledging what is coming or happening. So the history of budgeting has been revenues are coming in lower. We're not going to acknowledge that revenues are coming in lower. We're going to keep spending at the rate as if that wasn't going to happen. Part of budgeting responsibly is looking at what's coming, planning, and making responsible decisions. So that's all we're saying here. One, we want to highlight we're dependent on federal funds. We're dependent on federal funds like many other states are. They're all going through this exact same exercise. They're all going through the same exercise of having to look at what's going to happen. Many of them have said publicly they may have to reopen their budgets. Many of them are dealing with this. We want to make sure that we're dealing with it here as well. We're paying attention to it. And in a different world, maybe we don't have to deal with these impacts, right? Which is why we're not making decisions in advance of those cuts happening. But we need to look at what the landscape is and be prepared for it and understand it and plan for it. And we're working with the government in doing that. But we hope, right, that it would have the least amount of impact as possible so we can focus on other things which are growing the economy, creating jobs.
Amen.
Thank you, Robert, board members, and members of the press. We conclude our press conference. Gracias a todos.
Gracias.